The echo of dreams. The sound of music drifted across the windswept streets of a quiet neighborhood, but it wasn't the sweet, familiar notes of a professional pianist. It was the sound of fingers tapping on cardboard, a crude imitation of a melody that hung in the air like a whisper. A young boy, no older than 14, sat in the corner of his cramped, run-down living room. His eyes were closed, his head slightly tilted as he focused all his energy on the rhythmic tapping of his hands. He wasn't playing a real piano, no. His fingers gently pressed against a makeshift instrument, one fashioned out of cardboard, old tape, and painted keys. Despite the absence of true sound, he could hear the music in his mind. He could feel it. His name was Ethan, and though his circumstances seemed against him, his dreams were anything but small. He dreamt of becoming a pianist, one who could play as beautifully as the ones he heard on the radio or saw on TV. But there was one massive hurdle: money. His family couldn't afford a real piano. His father had barely enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. Yet, Ethan's hunger for music was far greater than the limitations of their situation. His fingers danced on the cardboard, the rhythmic beat growing more and more intricate with each passing day. When his fingers grew tired, he would switch, using the ends of pencils to tap out melodies. It didn't matter that it wasn't real. He felt the music deep within him. Every note was alive, every passage an emotional journey. Music was not just a hobby for him, it was the very air he breathed. Every day after school, he would come home and sit before his cardboard piano, imagining the day when he could play on a real one. But what was the point, really? It was a dream so far out of reach. People like him, poor kids with broken homes, didn't make it in the world of music. He was just another nameless boy in a small town, trying to escape his fate through something as impossible as music. One late afternoon, as Ethan sat in his usual spot, carefully running his fingers over the cardboard keys, a figure appeared in the doorway of the small house. It was a neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Adler, who had always been kind to him, though they had never spoken much. She had seen him before, with his cardboard piano, but that day, her gaze lingered longer. "Ethan, you're still at it, huh?" she asked gently, stepping into the room. The sunlight from the window cast a soft glow on her silver hair, and she wore a tired but warm smile. Ethan quickly stood up, a bit embarrassed. "Sorry, Mrs. Adler. I was just practicing." Mrs. Adler, who had lived alone for as long as anyone could remember, regarded him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I've heard you. You've got something, Ethan. You've got real talent." Ethan blinked, his heart skipping a beat. "You think so?" He never thought anyone noticed his music, especially not someone like Mrs. Adler. The elderly woman nodded, her eyes gleaming with a quiet intensity. "Yes, I do. But talent like yours shouldn't be wasted. You should have a real piano." Ethan laughed bitterly. "Yeah, right. I don't think we can afford that." Mrs. Adler didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced out the window, as though gathering her thoughts. Finally, she spoke again. "I think I can help with that." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I'm not asking you to understand now," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "But I've got something for you. A gift, if you will." Before Ethan could ask more questions, Mrs. Adler left the room and disappeared into the fading daylight. He stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and hope. Had he imagined what she said? Was she just being kind, or was there something more to it? Within minutes, she returned. But she wasn't alone. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, stood behind her. He was pushing an enormous, old-fashioned piano, the kind that looked like it had seen decades of history. Its dark wood was polished, but the keys were yellowed with age, and the strings likely needed tuning. It wasn't much, but it was real. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Is that? No, it can't be. Mrs. Adler smiled softly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. It's for you. It's yours if you want it. Ethan could hardly believe his eyes. How could she afford this? How could she even have it? His mind raced, but he felt a tear form at the corner of his eye. This was a dream come true, something he never thought would happen, not in a million years. I don't know what to say, he murmured. Mrs. Adler placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to say anything. Just promise me one thing. Anything, Ethan whispered. Promise me you'll play like your life depends on it, she said, her voice steady, but with a hint of urgency. Promise me you'll make something beautiful of this. The world needs your music. Ethan nodded, his hands trembling with the weight of her words. I promise. From that moment on, the cardboard piano was abandoned, replaced by the real thing. The sound that filled the small room was like nothing Ethan had ever imagined. Each note was a promise, each chord a step closer to his destiny. The music didn't just pour out of his fingers, it surged through him as though the piano itself was alive, feeding off his determination. As days passed, Ethan grew more skilled, each practice session an adventure of discovery. The sounds he created resonated deeper than ever before, weaving melodies that spoke of pain, of hope, and of dreams coming true against all odds. Mrs. Adler was always there to encourage him, sometimes quietly sitting in the corner, listening intently to the music, offering him a kind word when he faltered. But as Ethan's skill grew, so did the pressure he placed on himself. The weight of his dream grew heavier with each passing day. Was he truly good enough? Was he meant for this? At night, when the house was quiet, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by self-doubt. His mind was a constant whirlwind of thoughts. What if he was just fooling himself? What if this was just a temporary moment of happiness that would slip away when he least expected it? Then one fateful night, something happened that changed everything. It was late, and Ethan had been playing for hours, his fingers dancing across the piano keys. The melody was soft and mournful, a song that he had composed on his own, drawing from the depths of his heart. Suddenly, the music stopped. He glanced up, startled. A shadow moved across the room. Just a flicker at first, something he couldn't quite make sense of. Then, the air in the room grew colder, and a strange sensation washed over him. He wasn't alone. From the corner of the room, he saw a figure emerge. It was translucent, shimmering with an eerie, pale light. Ethan's heart raced, his breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly approached. It was Mrs. Adler. But this wasn't the woman he knew. Her figure seemed to be made of mist, her eyes glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Mrs. Adler? Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. She smiled, but it was not a smile he recognized. There was a sorrow in her eyes, a deep sadness that made Ethan's chest ache. I'm not long for this world, Ethan, she said, her voice distant and hollow. But I needed you to promise something. I needed you to promise to play. Ethan stood frozen, unsure of what was happening. Was he dreaming? Was this some cruel hallucination? I've watched you, she continued, her voice steady despite the eerie surroundings. You've got something more than just talent. You've got heart. But there's one more thing I need you to do. Anything, Ethan gasped, his voice barely a whisper. Don't let your dreams die, she said, her form beginning to fade. Make your music your legacy. Share it with the world, and you'll be free. With those final words, Mrs. Adler vanished into the air, leaving Ethan standing alone in the darkened room. The next morning, when Ethan awoke, he felt different. The weight of the world seemed to have lifted from his shoulders. He no longer had to wonder if he was good enough. He didn't have to fear failure. All he had to do was play. And so he did. Years passed, and Ethan's music reached far beyond his small town. He played in grand concert halls, his melodies filling the air like a promise. People wept when they heard him play, their hearts moved by the passion and soul that poured from his fingers. He became a name known across the world, a testament to what could be achieved when you believed in something greater than yourself. One day, many years later, as he stood in front of a packed audience, playing the final note of a piece that had taken him years to perfect, Ethan thought back to the old woman who had given him everything. He knew now what she had meant. She had given him more than just a piano. She had given him the key to his soul. And as the last note of the music reverberated in the silence, Ethan smiled. His dream had come true. He had become the pianist he had always wanted to be. And it wasn't just because of the piano. It was because he had never given up on his dream. The legacy of his music lived on, and somewhere, in the soft echoes of the melody, he could hear her voice. "You did it, Ethan. You kept your promise." And he knew, for the first time, that everything, every note, every dream, had been worth it.
Whispering echoes.